So all of this is just a very quick excerpt at 100 miles an hour from the report Later Life in 2015. But I think I found some really telling things in this. I've nursed my mother and my stepfather to their deaths in the last 18 months in Lambeth. It was pretty awful most of the time. Death was fantastic. And Claire Tickell, I think, is lurking somewhere in the audience, was explaining to me that I was lucky to be in South London where death is good. And it was brilliant. I mean, I'm absolutely going to... In fact, I'm moving into my mother's house so that when the time comes, I will have a good death. But the process of getting there was a bit of a nightmare. And if my parents had prepared better, and if perhaps some of these participants had prepared better, things might have worked out a bit differently. So what have we found? These are the things that people say are important. I mean, not immediately surprising, but I think what's interesting, and it confirms all of the extensive literature on well-being for people of all ages, of course, is friendship. And that doesn't necessarily cost money, but it's one of the things that makes the biggest difference. And some of the most miserable people aren't necessarily poor, but they are lonely. And which is in a way an irony in this ever connected age that we now find ourselves in, but certainly that came out as important. Now they are interrelated, and the extent to it, and they do also have an impact on how people feel. People aren't expecting to be running marathons at 80 or doing all these sorts of things. People have pretty modest expectations. But it needs to be just good enough. People accept that they're going to be getting old, although I think our ideas as a society about what a 70-year-old is like are now very different from perhaps 30 years ago. For me, as I've just turned 50, my motto is 50 is the new 30, etc. And also, of course, so much is about personal outlook. And I think this is a sensitive area, but the mindset and how you think about yourself seems to really, really matter. You can be well off with friends and miserable. You can be poor and happy. It's obviously generally better to have enough money to live on, but nevertheless, it's not uniquely about simple finances. So overall, in terms of segments, these are how we've split up the population through complex mathematics to come up with 6 clusters based on 30 different criteria. And we've called them thriving boomers. So Jeff Filkin is a thriving boomer. Downbeat boomers, by definition, almost none of you are going to be downbeat. Well, there might be 1 or 2 lurking. One of you was claiming to be a downbeat boomer earlier. Can-do and collected. I can see plenty of can-do and connected here. The worried and disconnected, almost by definition, won't be here. And these are the miserable old men without any friends, who we need to make sure they get some friends when they're a bit more young and mobile. But anyway, we'll go on to them. The squeezed middle age, those of you, and indeed me until very recently, dealing with troublesome teenagers at one end, and of course my ailing parents at the other end, simultaneously. And of course, overall, if you look at Dan Gilbert's book, Stumbling on Happiness, you will generally be most miserable in your life. Not in your 70s, and in fact on some models happiness peaks at the age of 23 and 73. But of course you'll be most miserable when your children are aged 12 to 16, not, but it gets better after they leave anyway. And then of course we have the struggling and alone. So just introducing you to those then, actually 1 in 5 of these people, really positive. They have very high levels of happiness, actually higher than the average. They're reasonably financially secure, they're typically living with a partner, and they've got good connections. So they're taking part in concerts like the Solway Singers. If you're healthy, you can do a lot. You can plan everything else. So really optimistic, looking forward to the future, and life is good. And their data, if you want to see it, looks like this. 77% of those people are scoring themselves 9, or at least 9 or 10 out of 10 on a rating of how they felt about life yesterday. So that's pretty good, 77%. The average is only 29%. 89% reporting high levels of companionship, 91% happy about their money, 92% reporting excellent or good general health. So in a sense, we don't need to worry about these people. They could probably provide lessons to all of us. This group is a bit more interesting. These are actually not necessarily living in completely different circumstances to the previous group, but they tend to have a negative outlook on life. It's all about, why didn't I become a Formula One driver? Or maybe, or the boss of X or Y or something. And they reflect more, rather than enjoying themselves, they're reflecting on things that have been left behind or opportunities they've missed. Life's getting worse as I get older. There's a lot I haven't done that I would like to have. So people who focus on loss and regret. And so their happiness, only 10% describing themselves as happy yesterday, despite the fact that 93% of them will say that they've got enough money to meet their needs. So very dramatic differences in terms of perceived well-being, even though they're not particularly worried about their health or their money. Now, to use a terrible Californian expression, could we teach people to hack their happiness, to focus on those things that actually might make them a bit more positive, to reflect in a different way on their lives? It's very fashionable. Maybe it would work for them. Can-do and connected, another 1 in 5. These are older people. They're often widowed. They lack some disposable income, but actually quite well, their well-being scores are fairly good, partly because they have strong social connections that they can rely on. My best friend, she's always there. I can lean on her with my troubles. So happiness, much better than the previous group, even though they're worried, much more likely to be worried about their money and their health. But actually, they're doing okay in terms of their social connections, and that being knitted in, that bridging social capital that they have with other people, that connectedness that we know is such a strong feature and driver of well-being, seems to matter for this group. And so, again, perhaps we don't worry quite so much about them. Then there's the 13% who are worried and disconnected. Isolated, it might be because they're bereaved, or they've lost the network that they had when they were at work. In a related piece of work recently for the National Health Service, we were filming people for some time sitting in their homes. And, I remember this man very telling, Anna, the one he's got, I used to have 3,000 people who reported to me. Now I've got emphysema, I'm stuck in this chair, I'm worthless. I might as well just die. I mean, that was literally how he saw his life. And so, absolutely, if you've got a partner, you can plan things, but it's different when you're alone. Somebody's died, you've split up. Of course, divorce rising amongst people in their 60s, and a very negative outlook on life. Only 4% rating themselves high in terms of happiness, even though plenty of money, above average, 81%. But the social connections seem to be this very strong driver with well-being and happiness. The squeezed middle-aged, those people perhaps with caring responsibilities for people who are still older, and of course their own children. They're busy, they're often in reasonable health, but they're at work. There's definitely some of you in this room, people who've got older parents and teenagers, and maybe grandchildren has thrown in just as well, just to keep things really interesting. 14%, lots of us are struggling. The previous generation didn't deal with teenage children and elderly parents at the same time. And he goes on to say, because actually the elderly parents had the decency to die. The way the demographics work out means it is a real issue. And so again, happiness only 11%, even though their health is okay, and social connections aren't bad. So lots of time poor and pressured, and not enough time perhaps to think about themselves. And indeed, one of the things that we know from all of the work on well-being generally is that if you look at people in the AB category in Britain, this is the senior professionals, of which there are so many in this room, by this point in your lives, the biggest thing that would, certainly in surveys at least, that you say you would make yourselves happier is more time with nature and to think and be alone, rather than more money or yet another promotion. So it's just worth reminding ourselves of all of that all the time. Struggling and alone, again, this is right across the age groups from 50 to 100. Again, they've got long-standing, long-term conditions, and that's starting to break down their networks, more likely to be worried about money, and actually among the least likely to be happy of any of these groups. I've applied for 20 jobs, and it was my first interview. I was heartbroken to find out I didn't get the job. And again, that lack of connectivity standing out is really important. So 5% again describing themselves as happy, but low on every single measure. These people don't even have the consolation of being secure in their finances or not particularly worried about their health. So what do we do for the struggling and alone group? 12% of the over 50s. They're low on virtually every single measure. And just very, very telling about that impact, not just of not having enough money, but the impact of loneliness on top. So when we ask people, what do they actually aspire to do? Again, fairly modest goals. Lots of people just want to spend more time with people, be they their family or their friends. We've got 44% who want to travel more, new pastimes, a bit of volunteering, and of course, and there are millions of people in this age group who want to do more volunteering, particularly if it can be packaged in ways that they can do. We've got people wanting to become fitter, etc. So lots of, some very consistent things, and a lot of it is just about being with people. How do we make that happen in our more fragmented society? This is a society that is least likely of any European society to sit down as a family at any age and have supper together. Any age. And again, you see some of the impacts of this when people are older. So summing up, I'd just say, at the moment, looking at these groups, despite some of them apparently thriving, there are far too many people who are missing out on a good later life. People probably are unaware of how their social networks are going to change and the importance of some of these soft factors in well-being. It's all very well having your pension planned out and your housing sorted, but if you're going to be lonely and alone, it's not going to make much difference. We can see that some of these individual groups need to spend a bit more time when they're my age thinking about planning for the future in a way that often, of course, we don't want to, because we don't want to contemplate mortality or anything else. But certainly that stands out. We've got that whole point about people reminding people that connections matter, that we spend a lot of time telling people to eat their 5 a day. We spend a lot of time telling people to exercise. We probably don't spend enough time telling people about their friendship networks and why they're so important. We know that those social connections, if people make them, can actually compensate for poor health or a lack of financial security. And again, just a reminder that that there are so many people who are missing out on all of these things. And this is exactly, of course, the issue that the centre will be addressing. And ultimately, it just reminds me the greatest human need, as Henry James put it, is simply to be appreciated. And I think sometimes in our terribly efficient and effective policy objectives, we miss that. Thank you.